Good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to extend my gratitude on behalf of BACS to GAP and ORF for inviting us. Before I start and give some facts about the project which we are talking about, I just wanted to give you a perspective of a distribution company in India. I'm heading power distribution in Delhi in BACS, which is a fairly large private distribution setup. Conventionally or traditionally, the distribution companies have been seen struggling with their finances, loss reduction, they don't have money to invest in capex. Reliability and quality of supply is a big issue for everyone. And how we address our consumers, how we deal with our customer, these are the traditional challenges which we have been facing. Not in so much in Delhi, but in other parts of India. But with the energy transition, which is very much there in knocking our doors for last 5-6 years, there has been a sea change in which a distribution company should operate. There are many challenges which are come, and with challenges we have huge opportunities also. And BACS has been one of the forefront companies in taking these challenges and opportunities. Just to give you a brief that we are serving about 5 million consumers. We have a AT&C loss of about 6.5%, which is comparatively very good as far as the Indian standards are concerned and are comparable to the best discoms in the world also. We have been rated as number 1 by Ministry of Power in terms of our consumer services which we offer to to our esteemed consumers in Delhi. We are managing a demand of almost 5,000 megawatt in Delhi. And with extreme summer and extreme winter, there are operational challenges which we have been coping with. In the last 5-6 years, we have taken up the challenges which are coming with the energy transition. We started with the tie-up of renewable power in terms of RPO obligations. We have almost tied up 2,400 megawatt of renewable power, which is almost 34% of our portfolio. We have done a bit of work in rooftop solar. We have about 135 megawatt of rooftop capacity in Delhi. We have more than 5,000 net metered connections. We have almost about 5,000 charging points which we have supported, developed in captive way or in private and public domain. So overall, we have been trying to play our role. We have also established a microgrid in Shivalik area in Delhi, which is one of the first projects in India where we have solar along with battery and charging station. We have also done some work on the demand side management, which is also very new to a distribution company because traditionally distribution companies are running on the supply side. But demand side management is something which is very much desirable, particularly when we are looking into the energy transition. We have tried to work out a project where behavioral energy efficiency parameters are being mapped, where behavioral sciences can be used with data science, and we can see how consumer behavior works and how we can manage. We have done some small projects on battery energy storage also on the lower voltage level at the DT level. We have been working to work out a commercially viable and scalable project on the battery energy storage at the grid level for the last 3-4 years. And we are really grateful to GAP who came to us a few months back and to work on this project. This is a collaboration and a consortium which was initiated by GAP. We have RMI and Deloitte. We have also inducted TETD in some aspects. And we were basically looking out in an opportunity where we can make this battery energy storage a self-sustaining project, where the cost and benefit are more or less matching, so that it goes through the regulatory process more easily. It doesn't affect consumer tariff. And this is something which can be technically tested and proved, that battery energy storage is something which is desired, is very much required when we are looking into a distribution network. And this is one of the first project, which is 20 by 40 megawatt hour project at the grid level. We have selected a Kilokri grid, which is one of the very, it has a high consumer, load, and there is a lot of variability also in the load. So this was probably one of the good grids where this project can be tested, where we have worked out, simulation has been worked out for a lot of data, that how this project can be viable in terms of energy arbitrage opportunities, how we can help, how this system can help us in peak management, and also some other aspects like capex deferral and other things. So once this project is approved by the regulator, and though we have got the in-principle approval, but once it has the final approval, we are quite hopeful. The way Saurabh ji has been driving this project, we are quite hopeful that in the next few months, this project would be very much live and real. And many of the people who are associated with this project are very much excited, because this is something new which is happening in India. And I'm very grateful that BSCS has been chosen to be the front runner on this project. And we look forward to more such application, not only in BSCS, but across various other states and various other grids, not only at the distribution level, but also at the transmission level. I am thankful to the GAP and the entire team of Deloitte and RMI for supporting this project. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sinha, for your leadership on the project. My name is Clay Stranger. I'm with RMI. If we look across the energy transition, I think there are a few themes, technologies, or topics that are more intersectional and at the heart of the transition than batteries. We look across the mobility sector and the power sector. We think about issues around human rights, supply chain, economic growth, industrial opportunity. Batteries really sit at the center of these opportunities, of the overall transition. It's my pleasure and privilege to help launch this Powering Progress Market Action Report today. And in particular, if we look at India's very ambitious 2030 renewable goals, battery energy storage systems are going to be required. We see as much as 40 gigawatts of battery energy storage systems required over the next 6 years to get where India intends to go from a renewable standpoint. And that is for grid stability, for load balancing, and integration of renewables. So this report has been written to showcase and outline the path to get from basically a zero base today of BESS, with this project being one of the first major projects, up to over 40 gigawatts in 6 years. The actions outlined and about to be introduced by Jagaban will define what that roadmap looks like. And my pleasure to introduce Jag, one of the lead authors of this paper, to outline some of the key steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. I'm Jagaban. I'm principal with RMI, and in partnership with GAP has been driving this activity for the past 6 months or so. Just pick up from what Clay mentioned, and I'll keep it pretty short. The green is where renewable is expected to be, variable renewable by 2030. The yellow is the need for batteries. Now, you may think the yellow is small, but without the yellow, the little sliver of yellow, the green is not going to be possible. And that's essentially the common consensus that people in the government, people in think tank space, people in the private sectors are starting to converge towards. Now, of course, we function within in electrical infrastructure systems where a lot of enablers are happening, which suits battery, but it's still within the constraint of a systemic challenge that the Indian power sector operates under. I mean, just have to recap, of course, your peaks are growing, the amount of renewable in the system is increasing, and invariably that demands higher degree of flexibility and an opportune environment for batteries to emerge. But your utilities are poor credit rating, you have high losses, and the system and operational readiness are extremely limited and needs to be brought forward. And now the point to emphasize, of course, is that if you want to accelerate at the scale that Clay just mentioned, from practically 0 to almost 40 in 6-7 years, a lot needs to happen in a very short period of time to make the cost economics of battery work. Now, this is a very crowded chart. The point I'm trying to make is extremely simple, and it is that India is a vast country. The need for battery is universal. The value for battery needs to be situated within the local context. Just to quickly explain the chart, is that basically the width of the bars are the share that each of the state has in India's power demand, and the y-axis is how peaky their load profile is. So just to give you the scale at which India operates, of course, the peakier the profile, the higher, theoretically higher, need for batteries or some sort of flexibility that the systems will have. Just to recap, Delhi is very well situated, hence the pilot in Delhi. A lot is happening in the country to try and to encourage batteries and get the right policy environment. Culminating, of course, in the National Energy Storage Framework and the Viability Gap funding. But the time now is to get regulatory unlocks that, takes that policy levers forward, and also to create market actions to actually see deployments on the ground in the next few years. And this is the core of the report. I want to concentrate on this slide in particular, is basically what Dr. Sinha was mentioning about value stack. And it is not the Delhi project, but it is a comparable project of 10 megawatt, 20 megawatt hour, and how under different revenue arrangement, under different financing mechanism, the dotted period part, which is basically the value gap, can be narrowed down drastically. Now, the basic point for the non-initiate is that value stacking essentially is that the same battery asset, if the policy environment, market environment are right, can provide multiple value stream, which even if the cost of the value is high, can make the revenue and the cost economics work. So you kind of start accelerating deployment of battery if you design the project well. That's the basic point of it. The next point that I just wanted to emphasize is on the fact that the cost of deploying a battery, and of course there will be more localized context to it, and this is an academic representation of the cost levers. The basic point is that there's a lot of soft cost levers that are there beyond the cost of the battery itself. And the point I'm trying to make is that if you design your project well, if you're able to streamline your processes, if you're able to access cheap financing, and if you're able to think about reducing duties and taxes, there could be a way to encourage battery fairly early on, relatively. And GAP's low-cost financing to support this project is a clear example of some of the soft cost reduction that can help. This is a laundry list of all the recommendations that the report has, and a lot of it came from the stakeholders. I just want to, and I don't want to go through it. I'm encouraging you to go through it when you get a chance to get your hands on the report, or go through our website at rmi.org. But the two basic points, just an example, is in the near term, what we feel from a policy level is going to be required is aspects around, I'll just give two examples. One is on, we have an ancillary services market regulations that's been approved, but a lot of the pricing mechanisms are not transparent. And some of the product, like the primary reserve, doesn't really favor batteries right now, so there is a need to be more transparent about the pricing. There needs to be transition towards market mechanism. On the slightly medium-term period, you need to be looking at evolving a capacity market. Ultimately, that's the biggest market creator and enabler for batteries to come onto the systems. with those two recommendations, and I think there's a lot of other recommendations which gets deeper into the processes, IT systems, etc., that gets into the weed of the report. I will leave you with this, and I'm going to take a pause and then call the people, some of the people who are involved in working on the report for a quick photo op and a report release. I want to call Akshama Ghate, our MD. I want to call Vikram. I want to call Saurabh from GAP, of course. I want to call Eric Vanlas. I want to call Umang. I hope I haven't missed anyone, but a quick, on stage, we can do a quick photo op and formally have the report launched, please.
Our next consultation on devising a blueprint for a people-positive energy transition is a perfect example of GAP's belief in collaboration and alliancing. May I please invite on stage Mr. P.K. Sinha, former Cabinet Secretary to the Government of India, Saurabh Kumar, Vice President GAP India. May I also invite Shubhranshu Patnaik, Senior Partner Deloitte, to kickstart the proceedings.
Good evening, friends. As we come up to the end of day 3, this is a very interesting segment. What we'll present now is a microcosm of what happened over the last 2 months, so to say. So I'll call upon Mr. Sinha in a while, but just to start off things, there are 6 pillars on which we had very engaged discussions in working groups, or dialogues as we called it. And so I'll call upon Mr. Sinha to introduce how we went about it, the 6 pillars, and what were those. And then we'll take it from there. There's a communique which will get released as a conclusion of the dialogues. But then we'll present back in very short snippets, because the time is limited, the 6 pillars and what were the outcomes of those from an energy transition perspective. So can I call Mr. Sinha over to just introduce that?
Good evening, everybody. Well, last session before the closing session, but I think it's a very important session, going to be a little heavy also. We actually seek your attention and would invite your comments also and questions, if any. As you know, India has given itself very challenging targets up to the year 2030. New capacity of 500 gigawatts from non-fossil fuel sources, meeting 50% of the energy requirement from non-fossil fuel sources, reducing energy intensity by 45%, reducing carbon emissions by 1 billion tons. All these targets have to be achieved by 2030. Now, if you just look at these 2 targets, 500 gigawatt capacity addition and 50% energy requirement up to 2030, it's quite challenging. We add about 15, let us say, gigawatts of renewable capacity every year. And therefore, to scale it up from 15 to 50 we'll have to, the effort will be much beyond business as usual. And what are the opportunities available? Well, as I think, the rooftop is one area, rooftop solar, both residential and MSMEs and industry, all sorts of buildings. This is still an unexplored area, and targets that we had given to ourselves for the rooftop solar capacity, the achievement has been much less. So this is an opportunity waiting to be exploited. Similarly, solarization of the agriculture sector, whether solarization of rural feeders or solarization of agricultural pump sets. Again, another area waiting to be exploited. Then new initiatives like offshore wind, floating solar, hybrid solutions of wind and solar and battery. These are the areas from where this additional effort will have to be made, and this capacity can be scaled up. Now, meeting in 50% energy requirement from non-fossil fuel sources. As you know, power and transport, these are the two major sectors which contribute to emission. And power, I mentioned, what are the opportunities waiting to be exploited. In the transport sector, apart from pushing electric vehicles, we need to look at the biofuels, blending of biofuels, production of biofuels in a big way. And also, another very important area is to modal shift from the road, not just to railways, but also to water transportation, whether it is coastal transportation along the sea route or it is inland waterways. So these areas, again, when we talk of coastal transportation on inland waterways, not yet exploited. Obviously, policy interventions are required in order to be able to move the cargo from road to these modes. Similarly, shifting from road to railways is also a challenge because the freight tariff in railways has become so high, but is not able to increase the passenger tariffs, the freight tariff. As a result, road transportation has become cheaper. So these are some of the challenges which I wanted to mention and give you an overall perspective. But the task which GAP and its partners, 21 partners gave to themselves was to draw up a roadmap, an action plan of how to meet these targets up to 2030. And I think that is the core objective of the dialogue also. We have heard some very eminent speakers. They have given their recommendations, their ideas. Over the past about 2 months, GAP and its partners, they have worked really hard. I can tell you because in between I was getting drafted also to the discussions. They have worked very hard, trust all the experts and stakeholders, and have come out with a set of recommendations. They divided the whole subject of these targets up to 2030 into 6 themes. One was roadmap for enhanced renewable energy and best ambition of 50 gigawatt per annum. 2, scaling up energy efficiency. 3, clean energy financing. 4, decarbonization of transport sector. 5, people-centric energy transition. And 6, roadmap for utility modernization. So these 6 themes together, you would agree, are the ones which are crucial and relevant for taking the country towards targets up to the year 2030. So they worked on these 6 themes between themselves in discussion with experts and stakeholders, and Pranshu will be presenting on these 6 themes briefly what the policy recommendations and other recommendations are. And after that, if there are any questions or new ideas, then we'll welcome that. And this document or this communique, which has emerged, which will release today, this will become like a base document. Every year when the dialogue happens, it can be reviewed, see where we are, how much we have achieved, and what more we need to do to be able to get to our 2030 targets. And I think with that, I will stop and invite Pranshu to start with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Building on what Mr. Sinha said, just to introduce, the 6 pillars were anchored by some of the partners. Of course, the dialogues were held with a broad cross-section of experts, public, private, utilities, and government representatives in the, about 15 representatives, 15 or thereabouts in each of the pillars. The first one was led by World Bank and GIZ, as you see. That was their coordination role. The second one, scaling up energy efficiency, was led by WRI. And we have Deepak Krishnan here who will present that. Clean energy financing was led by AIFA, CPI, and ADB. Again, that will be presented by AIFA. Decarbonization of transport, led by Terry and Shakti Foundation. Since we do not have a representation today, I'll be presenting that. People Positive Energy Transition, UNDP and iForest. Again, I'll walk you through that. And then the last one on utility modernization by IntelliSmart and Deloitte. So Anujesh and IntelliSmart representatives are here. They will present that. So without further ado, let's go through the recommendations that came forth from the deliberations. All right, so the first one on scaling up renewable energy, I think the first thing that got discussed was, while we do have plans at the national level, and pretty ambitious plans, and we have institutions which have done well, whether they are ministry or the agencies of the ministry like SECI and others who've done really well, there is a dire need to actually downscale and expand that, first the target, the net zero target, as well as the ambitions down to the state level itself, right? And that is where the meat of the action is, both around institutional arrangements at the state level, which is required, as well as the level of resource assessments that's required now that the program has moved from, let's say, solar park schemes to, actually the private sector arranging for itself most of the requirements. So how do we go back to really states playing a very active role was one of the things discussed. The other part that got discussed also was how do we get the private sector, which is the corporates, which already have signed up to RE100 and more ambitious plans of transition, be part of the demand mix itself and drive this transition. So that's also something that we discussed significantly in the working group. The second recommendation that came through was with regards to the medium to longer term ambitions, where all technologies will come into play. Well, the focus in the interim has obviously been, for the right reasons, on solar and wind, onshore wind. A lot of it will start to move towards all other kinds of technologies, including offshore wind and floating solar and such. So how do we look at that? And then the most important element, of course, batteries start to become front and center, as we've been hearing through the last 2 days, in very quick future. Within a couple of years, you start to see a lot of demand for batteries, given that the existing flexibility in the system is getting eroded from the perspective of the renewable capacity addition that we are going through. So how do we make that happen in a significant manner is one part of the focus that went through. And then, of course, the move towards, even when you're looking at provisioning infrastructure, look at provisioning infrastructure from a dispatchability perspective also. So therefore, more focus on dispatchable renewables. And within that, the role of RE plus parks, which is RE plus storage as well as hybrids. The third element that got focused on significantly was, of course, storage itself, and storage from an RE market integration perspective. As I said, before we realize, most models are saying within a couple of years at the state level, the need for storage will exponentially grow. And so therefore, the need for making sure that our capacities get built across the system, whether it is regulators, they need to understand the value of storage, assess it, and approve storage projects. The storage is a strange animal, right? As we've been hearing through the last 2 days as well. It acts as a demand, it acts as a supply. So therefore, how do you assess it? Looking at just the cost of power from a storage plant is probably the most damaging way of looking at storage. So how do you look at storage? How do you value storage? And I think the last session, or the last but one session, which spoke about the successful project that we're looking at in Delhi itself would be a good example of taking that forward where GIAP is involved. So how do you look at that? But storage, not just from a battery perspective, also from a PSP perspective, and maybe a mission mode approach to that, given the potential that India has, was also discussed. The fourth one was on making rooftop and distributed renewables come back into the equation. We know that it is almost 200 to 300 gigawatts in terms of assessed potential. So how do we get that going in a mission mode? How do we make sure that policies, regulations, right at the subnational and municipal levels encourage rooftop solar participation? And then, of course, also in irrigation and agriculture, how do we get that going? So there are recommendations which came out of the deliberations on that aspect also. And finally, the two other elements, which is when you take it down to the state level, If you say, for instance, have a net zero plan at the state level, at the moment it is viewed as a cross-cutting theme and doesn't get owned up by anyone, right? You could have agricultural targets, you could have industry targets, you could have transport targets, you could have power sector targets, but it doesn't necessarily get owned up by anyone. It was felt that there is a dying need for actually having an institutional mechanism which coordinates across the state levels, across departments at the state level. At the national level, that can be Niti Aayog, which was the recommendation of the body of the roundtable. But at the state level, we need to find one institution which mimics that. So that was one of the elements that got discussed. And finally, of course, skills and capacity development. We are in an era where we are building out a completely new energy system globally. The kind of change that the globe hasn't seen in the energy system for the last 100 to 150 years. And so therefore, underestimating the degree of capacity changes across the system would be a mistake. So therefore, how do we focus on skill development all throughout? So that was the focus of this particular theme. I now call upon Deepak to work us through the energy efficiency theme.
Thank you, Shubhranshu, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for inviting me, ORF and GIAP. We could have the energy efficiency slides, please. So in the meantime, while the slides load, so for the energy efficiency segment, we looked at 3 sectors, buildings, space cooling, and MSMEs. We all know the potential for energy efficiency and the need to adopt these measures. The G20 New Delhi Declaration itself spoke about doubling the rate of energy efficiency by 2030. IEA scenarios also indicate that 40% of emissions abatement by 2040 is going to happen through energy efficiency measures. So within the energy efficiency, we'll start off with buildings, wherein we have 2 categories of new buildings and old ones. So primarily the theme here is that we have the codes in place. Fine, minor tweaks may be needed, but the focus should now be on implementation and strict penalties and monitoring and verification. That was one of the main recommendations that came out. While we also try and quantify the energy content, embodied energy needs to start entering the lexicon of our energy efficiency conversations. One of the more important suggestions that came up was, instead of just looking at prescriptive codes, which then needs a litany of steps to monitor and assess, why not have energy performance indicators as references, which then buildings will need to comply. A simple numerical measure which all buildings can measure. The added advantage of this being that even traditionally designed architectures also need, which may not fall into the scope of the earlier code, will come into that. Also, looking at different types of renewable energy technologies that and strengthen compliance with respect to buildings regulation. As far as existing buildings are concerned, again, the theme coming that not all buildings are the same. We need a significant assessment of what are the different types of building topologies are there, and then plan out our retrofit measures. Expanding the pool of service providers on the energy efficiency and renewable energy front was another suggestion that came up through all the discussions. Life as a theme for behavioral change has been touched upon quite a bit in the conference, and our behavior changes in different ways. As building owners, our behavior is different. As tenants, our behavior is different. So how do we develop those nudges to cater to these different segments? Is it through the way of campaigns? Is it through technology interventions? International collaboration on technology transfers, market mechanisms was another suggestion that came up. And last but not the least was engaging with the distribution companies and the state electricity regulatory commissions. They are a ever-present, significantly huge consumer platform which can help leverage a lot of these energy efficiency transitions in new buildings. As far as cooling is concerned, again, Apurva in the morning with the launch of the LC4 coalition spoke about how the ICAP is already there, and again, focus needs to be on implementation, monitoring, and verification. The same theme was echoed in all the consultations that we had carried out. Super efficient appliances was the need of the hour. In addition, also looking at appliances that aren't just efficient, but are also having the inbuilt capability to participate in demand response mechanisms which the regulator can help design. Nature-based solutions was an important aspect that came up as something which we shouldn't lose track of and not end up being dependent only on appliance energy efficiencies. So that was one other recommendation that came out. And last but not the least was to prioritize the thermal comfort needs of vulnerable communities. It is easy to forget that plugging in ACs can help solve the problems for some consumers, but there are a significant number of people who are vulnerable to thermal stress, and their needs need to be catered to. So on MSMEs, one of the major recommendations that came up was learning from the perform, achieve, trade mechanism that BE has been running for the last many years, and specially design something focused on MSMEs, given that right away they cannot participate in trading mechanisms. One of the other suggestions that came up was to develop a focused pilot comprising of MSMEs, technology providers, financing institutions to try and do a very focused, time-bound pilot, and the results of the monitoring and verification from those be made available publicly so that schemes can be designed accordingly. Capacity building across all segments, the industry owners themselves, financiers, and also creation of a knowledge platform, because there have been innumerable studies that have been done, DPRs sitting in multiple repositories. So how can that knowledge be made available in a common source so that we don't end up reinventing the wheel? And the last one was on actual financing itself, payment guarantee mechanisms for energy efficiency, and also see to it that other financing mechanisms like which have succeeded in the world also be made available and made a success of this. Thank you very much. Over to Vibhuti.
Good evening, everyone. I'll be talking about the 7-point agenda that we have worked along with CPI and ADB on the energy financing needs. While we have written this over the last 2 months, but it was good to see in the last 1.5 or 2.5 days of deliberation, some of these points have already been touched upon in much greater detail. But the next few slides are going to show which are the key things that need to be undertaken if we are really serious about bringing in more and more investments into the clean energy transition landscape in India in the short to medium term. As you can see, there is a big financing gap, so addressing some of these gaps becomes critical. So the first and the foremost is on the banking sector reforms. It's largely been recognized now that climate risk is a big financial risk. And if it's not tackled now, it's going to be becoming a more systemic risk going forward. So while the banks do identify the physical aspect of the risk, but the transition risk is something which is still not clear to many banking and the financial institution. So there is a clear need for RBI to come up with the right structures and frameworks so that people do understand, or the banks and the financial intermediaries understand what it means when we are talking about these climate risk into the financial system. This will need a lot of capacity building of the frontline banking system. So there is a strengthening of capacities to understand the climate risk that becomes again critical. And lastly, if the banks and the financial intermediaries have to consider or build the scenarios for the climate risk, there is clearly a need for a proper disclosures from the borrower's side. So having a proper disclosure mechanism in place is something which will enable the banks to consider those kind of risks. So that's on the banking sector reforms. Secondly, there's been enough discuss on how the role of MDBs needs to change. And we also had a great session from Mr. N.K. Singh, where he presented some of the ideas from the triple agenda, how to MDBs can play a very pivotal role in unlocking private capital because they do have an appetite to take a lot of risk capital by providing credit guarantees. And rather than just providing the usual conventional loans, I think there is a very big space for MDBs to play that kind of a catalytic role by providing guarantees. And then also looking at it from the perspective of new innovative mechanisms, which can be either through cash flow linked structures or receiver-based financing structures that can really enable to unlock more and more capital. And lastly, again, they need to come up with very specific understanding by speaking with developers and come up with specific products which can vary from technology to technology, also from large to MSME players. Thirdly, lot of financing for renewable energy sector has largely been coming from the banking system. So the capital markets play a very, very critical role. And some of the reforms that needs to happen is, again, the credit guarantee schemes, which can bring in the much required or de-risk the off-taker risk that can enable a lot of domestic institutional investors as well to take that kind of risk if that money comes in. Also, we would need, one of the biggest other capital market risk is on the foreign exchange, foreign currency risk. How do we address that? We already have currency swaps in the country, but those are only like 12-month period. What we need is longer tenure foreign currency swaps, which are currently missing in the system. And lastly, a lot of insurance and reinsurance products are required, which we have seen there in the global market, in the developed world, this exists, but as far as developing countries and especially India is concerned, there's a big gap there, and we really need to come up with those products. Fourthly, I talked about long-term patient capital, which can come through pension funds and insurance company. Again, globally, a lot of money has been channelized through them, but in India, that is still a big gap. And some of these issues of lower risk appetite, not finding investable opportunities by these players has been a big concern. But more importantly, having the right set of policies has been one of the other big concerns. So having new mechanisms, like we do have InvITs, but specifically for RE, if those InvITs can come in, that can address some of the challenges. And also enhancing capabilities and institutional capacities for DIIs is required. ESG capital is bringing a big pool of money globally that has led, again, to providing a lot of investments in clean energy space, while India has successfully tapped some of this money, but there is more that needs to be done, and that needs to have, we need to have proper disclosures, we need to have a proper taxonomy for tapping into this ESG capital. And more importantly, that taxonomy needs to consider the social aspects, because India, while transitioning, needs to really consider the just transition aspects. So while these taxonomies are developed, we need transition or aspects or the social aspects to be included. Another big thing is, when we differentiate between based on the technology readiness, there are few startups that are bringing in the new research. So for early startups, there needs to be more institutional strengthening with educational institutes. For much more mature startups, one needs to have more de-risking required. And for the technologies which are more established, like solar rooftop or biogas, we need a lot more co-lending facilities, which is, again, can unlock a lot more capital. And then on the standardization, if you really want to make capital more scalable and deployed at a much larger scale, a standardization in terms of technologies is a must. And lastly, apart from all what I've listed, I think there are two more asks in terms of government intervention. One is the reduction in the guarantee charge, which is applied to MDBs, which can free up a lot of capital that they can deploy in infrastructure deployment, especially RE, and introduction of green plus bonds. As I mentioned, India really needs to consider the social aspect. So apart from having plain vanilla green bonds, you need a green bond plus system where social considerations are taken into account. Thank you. Hand it back to Subhranshu.
Thank you. We'll move on to transport decarbonization. This was, of course, anchored by Terry and Shakti Foundation. So amongst the major recommendations that came through, of course, the first, and just to put that in context, road transport accounts for almost 90% of the emissions in this country, right? And so therefore, the focus was on looking at passenger and freight transport from a road perspective, and that from an intercity perspective looked at electrification, which was a big focus. And the recommendation was to start to look at integrating electrification into the national roadmap as well as city plans, targeting government fleet to be transited as fast as possible. This can be very, very aggressively pursued. There's already success that we've had at the government level pursued by ESL in this segment. Payment security mechanism primarily from SRTU perspective, and then dedicated last mile connectivity also from state road transport perspectives. The second one, while we focus on electrification, which is a fuel shift, is also looking at fuel efficiency of existing fleets. So there of course, the need to adopt CAFE norms for two-wheelers and three-wheelers, that's missing, which is big part of the pollution aspect. And then, heavy vehicles, which are just 8% of the fleet, but contribute to almost 60% of the pollution, also need to transit from a efficiency perspective. So the adoption of Vecto for HDVs is a very big part of the recommendation. Higher incentives for phasing out inefficient vehicles. We have the scrappage policy, but it's not necessarily uniformly implemented across states. And then the clean freight program. So these were some of the recommendations from a fuel efficiency perspective. Ambitions for alternative fuels beyond electricity, beyond electrification, of course, transiting to RON 95, cost-effective low-carbon technologies like hydrogen, but from a hydrogen perspective, which is primarily thought of from a long-haul HDV perspective, how do you bring down the cost, right? There were recommendations that were suggested therein. R&D for advanced biofuel adoption, and then, of course, biogas and compressed biogas as a replacement for CNG was also suggested. The fourth was on modal shift to railways, which is obviously the most efficient in terms of carbon footprint as far as the country goes. How do we make the modal shift happen to railways and also to waterways? So integrating it into the plan itself is one aspect. But looking at the last mile connectivity as well as containerization so that the entire supply chain issues get addressed. While railways will always turn out to be a little costly, in the overall scheme of things, it looks even costlier because of the lack of these last mile connectivity. So how do you look at integrated development and containerization? Roadmap for improving energy efficiency in these segments as well, and the long-term roadmap for inland waterways as well. So these were recommendations which came through. And lastly, of course, the need for international collaborations, given that this is not an isolated segment by any stretch of imagination. There's a lot to learn from globally as well as to contribute globally. So how do we look at international collaborations, both in research as well as technology development? Moving on, I'm rushing through, sorry, we've stretched for time. We also focused on the people-centric approach for transition, right? While we're looking at energy transition, clearly, the stresses are coming through in some of our fossil fuel segments where we will see a large impact on people when the transition out happens from these segments. And so therefore, one of the important elements which got addressed in the deliberations is build a common taxonomy. At the moment, there's a lot of deliberations around people-centric transition, but there is not necessarily a common understanding of what it is. How do we look at it from a common frame that the country adopts, right? And it is not an international issue in isolation. It is a local, regional, community-level issue. And so therefore, India-centric definition is absolutely essential, which the government adopts. So that's something which got discussed first. And then building anchor institutions, both at the national level. At the national level, it could be Niti Aayog, but at the state levels, the example of Jharkhand was quoted, where they already have a just transition committee set up. And so therefore, that to be looked at so that you prepare and build out plans for the future. The third area, of course, is identifying key priority areas for whether it is for skilling, transition, safety nets, all of that. Starts to be focused and gets aligned to our overall plans. In this case, LTLEDS, Low Emissions Development Strategy. If that's the plan to be followed, then how do you align to that and look at transition? And then finally, of course, enable dialogues across platforms. This impacts people. And this is about not leaving anyone behind and also making sure that everyone is part of the transition and gives you the license for transition is something that got discussed. Finally, of course, can't escape the issue of financing. And if we start to look at this early enough, we get sizing out of this problem, both for public and private participation. And so this was also a big part of the recommendation. I'll now hand it over to Anujesh to walk us through utility modernization.
I know this has come up last in the sequence, but let us be very sure that utility investments, utility modernization is very, very central to energy transition. And if the necessary investments do not go in the distribution networks and the utilities are not modernized, the system will not be able to absorb the kind of renewable energy or intermittent energy that we are proposing to. We will have to continue to live with fossil fuels. So it is that important. And smaller countries, much smaller than India, have assessed the investment requirement in their networks, which is in excess of trillions of dollars. So you can imagine the kind of investment Indian electricity utilities will require to modernize. And therefore, the first topic here is that the utility network needs a lot of modernization and investments. And the most important thing there is that till now we have been dealing with access, we have been dealing with quality of power and those kind of issues. We have not really assessed the kind of investment our grids require to support energy transition agenda. First and foremost, there is a need to conduct an exercise wherein how much investment is required to support the kind of renewable energy that we are going to add by 2030, by 2040, and by 2050 is assessed. And it is made available to everyone so that regulators, utilities know that this is the kind of investment they have to make. The second topic is we are seeing so many extreme weather events these days. There is no clarity on how utilities are supposed to deal with. What is the kind of network that they should build which can withstand this kind of weather event? So there is a need for a CEA guideline on standards for dealing with or creating climate resilient T&D infrastructure. The third recommendation there is on the kind of investment that has happened until now is mostly radial. Utilities have mostly added consumers and they went on adding kilometers and MVAs to supply electricity to consumers. But the future requires very, very detailed planning, network simulation through load flow analysis and various other things. This cannot happen in the way it has been planned in the past. So they need to move and transition to software-based network planning, and this also requires regulatory frameworks to change. The fourth point there is within the utility itself, both management as well as the staff of the utility, they do not know how this kind of investment planning and execution has to happen. So capacity building roadmap for the utility personnel is extremely important. The second topic we came up with was utilities which have to really make this kind of investment. They have to be financially viable. And we know that utilities are dealing with political economy issues. There are basic challenges like utilities do not file for tariff. They do not prepare annual accounts. Obviously, this is a major fiscal discipline challenge. How does one deal with this? One of the solutions which has worked well in Odisha and Delhi is privatization, but we know that privatization has very limited political acceptance in our country. So if that is not possible, what do we do? So the recommendation was that utilities in states can be listed in stock exchange within a given time frame, let us say by 2030 or 2035, and listing will ensure that there is fiscal discipline in the way the government and the utility interact with each other, despite government majority in these utilities. The second recommendation was, we often talk about absence or limited independence in the regulators in our country. How do we make the regulators more independent? Possibly the process of appointing chairperson and members needs to be relooked. The other option we discussed was, can we have regional regulators? And if we have regional regulators, possibly they will become more independent than the regulatory setup we have today. The third recommendation here was, we know power distribution franchises became very popular in between, but they are mostly centered around loss reduction. And in today's context, we do not have, or we hardly have, very high loss pockets. So the franchisee model doesn't itself lend to creating infrastructure investments which are required for energy transition. So the idea is to come up with a new PSP model or private sector participation model, wherein a contractual arrangement between the DISCOM and a private party could be established, but the private party can make capital investments under the direct scrutiny of the regulator. The fourth recommendation here was around creating micro franchises in rural areas. Because we are getting so much distributed energy resources, maybe the micro franchisee, along with smart meters and other automation technology, can possibly lower the cost of supplying electricity to the rural consumers. The third category of recommendations was around digitally enabled utilities. Utilities have largely operated in a blind mode, I would say, and they have not actively managed their network or their system until now. But this will not work in the future. And utilities, if they have to manage intermittent sources of power, they have to really have the kind of IT enablement to have a real-time view on their system. One of the most basic problems here is that utilities do not know what is the kind of IT investment or digital investment they have to make. So the recommendation is that there should be a process for a countrywide review of digital maturity of DISCOMs. A central level body can do that. And this will enable all DISCOMs to understand where they stand and where they need to go in terms of digital interventions in the utilities. The second recommendation here is that we have seen in so many advanced countries, almost 30 to 40% of the utility staff is IT or technology staff. In India, you will see hardly there are IT people in DISCOMs, and this has to change. So there should be some kind of benchmarking at a national level, which will enable DISCOMs to understand the kind of IT capacity, kind of number of IT people they need to really transform themselves. The third recommendation was around SLA-based contracting, and we are already seeing this in smart meters, where AMI SPs are being appointed by utilities to install and operate smart meters. Possibly such an arrangement can be extended to capture other processes, customer care processes, maybe SCADA operation, ADMS operation, which are high technology and high impact processes. The fourth recommendation there is that mostly utilities are waiting and watching to adopt new technology. We do not have processes which encourage utilities to learn or experiment new technology and really benefit from them. In some countries, they have 1% of the capex reserved for R&D purposes. Something like that has to be introduced in the DISCOM so that they are not fearful of going for new technology. They really go forward and embrace those technologies on their own. The fourth category of recommendations was around furthering market reforms, and there's a lot that ministry has done on this in the recent times. The first recommendation that we as a group thought was, today mostly the scheduling is done by the state level load dispatch center only. Most of the DISCOMs are only submitting information and accepting the decisions taken by the SLDC. Now, if we have distributed energy resources, this system dispatch or load dispatch has to happen at a much granular level, and therefore this is the right time to introduce DSOs in the system. And the entire regulatory framework, at what level they should be, how much load they should cater, what should be the institutional setup, all that has to be clarified, and a timeline should be defined for introducing DSOs. The second recommendation was around having clear framework for market-based value analysis of energy storage in DISCOMs. A lot has been done on this, but most DISCOMs do not know what kind of analysis they need to do to justify an investment in battery energy storage system. A detailed framework will really help them, and this will fast-track investments in battery energy storage systems. The third recommendation was around introducing demand response and dynamic tariffs. And now that we have, or we are in the process of putting smart meters throughout all consumers in the country, this is the right time. And this will really help in managing the load along with the challenges of intermittency of renewable energy that is coming into the grid. And the last recommendation here was around having a more robust process for green tariff in DISCOMs, as the current green tariff that has been introduced in most states is not amenable to a trace and track that most of the corporates which want to transition to a net zero are looking for. Yeah, that's all. I'm sorry I had to rush through it. I know my time is up. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you all the partners. Before I start, let me welcome formally Mr. Tarun Kapoor, advisor to the Prime Minister. Thank you very much, sir, for sparing your time. Mr. Kapoor is an IAS officer of the 87 batch of the Himachal cadre. He has vast amount of experience in ministries of power, renewable energy, petroleum, and now he's serving as the advisor to the Prime Minister. So just to give you a sense of what when we designed this 2.5-day conference, it was a forum for high-level discussions, but we also were guided by Mr. P.K. Sinha that it should not just be something that we talk and we forget about it the next day. And therefore, we, along with 21 of our partners, including, and all of them are here in this room, like World Bank, ADB, GIZ, and many, many others, decided that we'll put together a roadmap in 6 thematic areas, and you heard one of them being presented as a recommendation. So these 21 partners had extensive consultations with stakeholders, experts, as to what can possibly be done. For example, how do you scale up renewable energy from 10 to 15 gigawatts per year to about 50 to 60 gigawatts in the near term? What do we do with battery storage? You heard about the utility modernization and so on. So what we wanted to do is a very concrete action plan coming out of this conference with the help of all the partners. And may I now request Mr. P.K. Sinha and Mr. Tarun Kapoor to please release this communique that will be part of our roadmap that we start working on and present it to our dialogues when we come back here next year. So Mr. Tarun Kapoor, Mr. P.K. Sinha.